please, Ruth.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you so much for having me on. So my one is I'm calling it a snowy locked room mystery. That's basically my elevator pitch.
Yeah.
But the slightly longer version of that is it's a locked room mystery set in a luxurious ski chalet in the French Alps, in this super exclusive resort called Saint-Antoine. And for the first time, I have two narrators, which is a departure for me. The first is the chalet girl, Erin. So she's like the host of the chalet. You know, she's in charge of keeping all the guests comfortable, and she works at the chalet along with her co-worker Danny, who's the chef. And the other narrator is Liz, who is the former PA to this company that has taken over the chalet for a corporate retreat. Now, Liz left this company a while ago for reasons you don't immediately find out. But because she was there right back in the beginning, she's ended up with this tiny 2% shareholding in this tech company. And they've now been offered this huge make or break buyout. So they've come to the chalet to thresh out the offer and decide whether or not to accept this enormous buyout offer. And the way the votes fall out is that Liz ends up with the casting vote. So she's under huge pressure from both sides to vote with them. And just as she's sort of plucking up her courage to tell people which way she's voting, they go out for this day of supposed R&R skiing, and one of the two CEOs disappears on the mountain and just disappears in the snow. And they're all trying to figure out whether this is an accident or whether she's just got lost and skied down into the valley and been unable to get back up, when there's an avalanche. And after that, more people start to die, at which it becomes apparent that the first death was not an accident. Not much of that is a spoiler, because you know the death count at the beginning. The book kicks off with a newspaper article that tells you how many people die, but what you don't know is who dies and when.
Yeah, it's a very unique way to do it with snow and things. But one of the most fascinating things for me was the song streaming service. And the first question that come up with in my head was what songs did you listen to and decide to include in the book, and why did you go for a streaming thing?
Yeah, so for anybody who hasn't read the book, the company that's taken over the chalet is this tech startup called Snoop. And Snoop's function is basically they allow you to hook up your Spotify or your Apple Play account or whatever you use. And it makes your listening public. So anybody who's a member of the service can spy on you or snoop on you at any time and see exactly what you're listening to, hear it beat for beat. And the kind of in return, you can spy on anybody else. So in signing up, you know that your listening is going to be made public. And the idea is that, you can snoop on your friends or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, but also on celebrities. So people sign up to see what, Jay-Z is listening to, or Beyonce or Lady Gaga or whoever their kind of musical hero is. And the idea is it's sort of like that, what feels like a really intimate connection with someone, because the music that you listen to tells you a lot about someone, and also the fact that that they're listening to it at this precise moment wherever they are in the world. It's supposed to be sort of like the tech version of, that thing when you're first going out with someone and you put one earbud in your ear and one earbud in their ear and you're listening to the same music at the same time. It's supposed to be a kind of tech version of that sort of intimate connection. So this is the idea for the app. And the reason I decided to use this company was I knew that I wanted to write a book about the world of work, because I realized when I sat down to write this book that I'd tackled dysfunctional families and romantic relationships and toxic friendships, but the other group of people that is a huge influence on many of us are the people we share our offices with, our co-workers, our colleagues, our bosses, and they can be fantastic. They can make your life so much richer and funnier and more meaningful. They can be supportive, or if you have a bad boss, they can make your life absolute hell. So I was interested in exploring the two sides of this, and I knew that I wanted to set the book in a ski chalet, and it then became a question of, well, what company would have the resources to hire a ski chalet for a corporate retreat? And
Yeah.
you know, the answer is not very many. It basically came down to either tech or finance, and I wasn't super interested in finance. I thought, I don't want to write about a hedge fund, I don't want to do the research. So having decided that, I had to sit down and invent an app, which turned out to be really quite hard. I kept coming up with ideas and then Googling it and finding out that it already existed. And I knew that one of the themes of the book was going to be kind of surveillance and how much people know about you. So I wanted the app to kind of reflect that idea of sort of spying on people. And I like the idea of it being a music app, because music tells you an awful lot about people. It's a very easy shorthand to character to say, well, you know, they're the kind of person who listens to Pink Floyd versus the kind of person who listens to Take That. You know, you've instantly got a sort of stereotype of them in your head. So I felt that a music app would kind of allow me to explore the characters through the music that they listen to. But having invented this app and come up with this idea, I then made the decision to every chapter, and because I have two narrators, the narrators swap each chapter. Every chapter would have a chapter header of the Snoop ID of the person who was narrating and what they're listening to at any one point. And at that point, I realised that my musical taste basically stopped in about 1998. Before that, I'm grand. I could tell you anything about Bowie or Pink Floyd or Blur or Oasis or whatever else you like. But after that, I just basically my iTunes stopped updating. So I handed the book in as a first draft. I had just said, Ruth, I think these songs are more the choice of a 40-something-year-old woman than a 27. I was like, yeah, my point. So it took, actually, one of the things that took the most research, aside from finding out about the whole world of tech and IP and shares, was researching the music choices. And I had to go back and look up a whole bunch of bands that I'd never heard of, and I went down some brilliant kind of Spotify rabbit holes and discovered some fantastic new voices, and then sent it off to some friends who had kind of old teenagers and was like, is this a cool band? Is this a band that a cool person would listen to? And they were very gracious and helpful and said, yes it is, or no it isn't, and whittled my choices down.
That's a fascinating thing. But you did tech with the previous one at Turn of the Key as well. So is tech the new theme for you, or is it just?
I don't know. I did, yeah. So Turn of the Key, for anybody who hasn't read it, is it's sort of an updated version of the Turn of the Screw, really. But it is set in a smart house. So it's a nanny who's looking after a bunch of small kids in a smart house, and the smart house is kind of ruled over by this slightly dystopian app called the Happy app, which like controls all aspects of the house and the lives and stuff. I'm not fascinated by tech per se. Like I'm as welded to my smartphone as anybody, but I'm not a particularly techie person. But I think the reason I find it interesting is because as a society, we're still deciding how we feel about this stuff. We love that when we Google, I don't know, the Royal Oak, it brings up the Royal Oak 2 streets across from us and not the one in Edinburgh. And, we love that when we Google Tesco opening hours, it knows that we mean our Tesco's and not the Tesco's in Padstow or Penzance or, wherever else. But equally, when we go to our local pub, we find it really creepy when we get little pings saying, would you like to review us on TripAdvisor? And here's a money off voucher for coming back. And, then we get followed around the internet by the products that we've Googled or the shops that we've gone into and get adverts for dresses that we tried on. And so some of this stuff we find incredibly creepy. But some of it we've come to rely on and even to expect. I just swapped to DuckDuckGo for my search engine, partly because I wanted to feel less spied on. But when you put Tesco opening hours into DuckDuckGo, it is just as likely to return you Tesco in Edinburgh or in Penzance, because it doesn't know where you live. So all the things that make Google a bit creepy are also all the things that make it work really well.
Yeah.
So as a society, we're sort of still figuring out that slightly Faustian bargain that we've made, where we're not sure what we're prepared to give up in return for convenience. And sometimes we feel fine about it and sometimes we don't. And, you know, that boundary is at different places for different people. And so I think for a writer, anything where people are sort of still trying to figure this stuff out and are still a little bit uncertain, it just makes for sort of quite fertile territory to write about. Because if my characters are uneasy about it, my readers probably are as well, in a little bit of a lower key way.
It's when I did the review, I described it as the perfect merge between modern and the golden age. What is it about the golden age things that appealed to you when you first started writing?
I don't know. I mean, when I wrote In a Dark, Dark Wood, I wasn't consciously, you know, trying to do a modern day Agatha Christie or anything like that. But when I handed it into my agent, one of the first things she said was, "Oh, it's very Christie-ish," and I kind of couldn't see it and sort of went, "I just don't really get that." But then, you know, the more people read it and the more reviews came out, the more people were making those comparisons. And I think it's partly to do with the fact that, you know, like many people, I grew up reading Agatha Christie. She was one of the first crime writers that I read. And then I moved on to Dorothy L. Sayers and Josephine Tey and all of those sort of golden age writers, really before I tackled any modern crime writers. And so I think they kind of imprinted on me what a perfect crime novel should look like in terms of the shape of the plot, the shape of the mystery, the way the pieces should click into place at the end, you know, the way it should be that kind of cerebral puzzle as well as a kind of emotional journey. And I think when I sat down to write, all of that unconsciously was in the back of my head and came out in the writing. And certainly initially it wasn't intentional. I didn't think I'll sit down and write a modern Christie. But when I was writing my second novel, The Woman in Cabin 10, the reviews for In a Dark, Dark Wood was starting to appear. And I was getting more and more comparisons to Christie. And so I suppose with The Woman in Cabin 10, I did much more consciously kind of lean into that comparison. But just because it was what people were saying, and I realized it was something that I enjoyed doing. So in a way, that was me kind of acknowledging my debt to that style of writing by trying to write something that was much more an updated sort of golden age. Because that book, you know, is set on a luxurious cruise, which is a very Christie-ish, you know, it's not the Murder on the Orient Express or Death on the Nile, but I feel like it's a setting Christie could have used.
Yeah, I think so too. When you was starting Woman in Cabin 10, and that was a burglary, have you ever feared something that dramatic and decided to start a story because of that?
Like, is it sort of based on my own kind of paranoias and experiences and stuff?
Have you got any fears that you might use in the future, or was that based on a fear?
I mean, I think most of my books are based on some sort of fear or phobia of my own. You know, they're usually more abstract, like the In a Dark, Dark Wood is really that fear of having done something wrong. You know, when you wake up at 3 a.m. and you're like, oh God, you know, was I really horrible to that girl in year 3? And did I run a red light yesterday? And, you know, should I have done this? And all those kind of things that plague your conscience in the middle of the night, that when you wake up, you're like, okay, this is ridiculous. But definitely, you know, that idea that you might be guilty of something and not kind of recognize it. And The Woman in Cabin 10 is really the fear of seeing something or experiencing something and not being believed, which is, I think, you know, something that lots of people worry about, but maybe particularly women, because so often in a he said, she said case, it's the woman's word that is in doubt. But yeah, I've always been scared, particularly as a child, not so much now, but I've never really been scared of kind of ghosts and sort of monsters under the bed and stuff, but more concrete fears like, yeah, being mugged, being broken into, hearing a noise in the middle of the night and not being sure, you know, is it someone trying to break in? And when I'd moved to London, it was in our second flat in London, so I was pretty young. Me and my friend had this absolutely terrifying experience where a guy in a balaclava, very like the one described in the book, unfortunately this was the middle of the day, so it wasn't quite as terrifying, came and like started trying to batter down the door, and we'd seen him coming up the path, so we could see he was all dressed in black and wearing gloves and a balaclava, so we were not about to open the door to this guy. And we went and hid in a back room, and he continued like banging on the door and screaming threats and shouting, "I'm going to kill you," and we were like, so we dialed 999 and sat there waiting, and then eventually the police phoned up and said, "Our car's outside, you could come out." So we came out. The guy had gone and left a note saying, "Sean McDuggan, I'm going to kill you," with various other things on it. We were like, police just looked at it and went, "Oh, he's clearly got the wrong house." And I was like, well, clearly, but what if he only finds that out after he's sent down the house? Yeah. So it was partly based on that, although fortunately my real life experience was not as traumatic as Lowe's.
Yeah. I've worked with victims of crime before, so that's what made me come up with that question. But what would you say that helps you out with your workers before you arrived? You worked in the industry itself, and what would you say you learned from that before you became a writer?
Yeah, so I worked as a press officer, and before that as a bookseller. I don't know really. People often ask if it helped when I became a writer, and I think it helped once I was published, because the publishing industry is very weird in many ways, and usually the stuff that they do does make sense, but it's not always evident from the outside why it makes sense. And I think lots of debut authors find it very frustrating for a long time, because there's these decisions being made that look from their perspective just, you know, inexplicable. And understandably, you know, editors and publicists and things take all of this for granted, so they don't always sit down and say, this is why this is happening, and this is what this terminology means, and here's why we do it like this. And I knew all of that, so it saved a lot of frustration and kind of you know, blood, sweat and tears. And it did also mean that I knew how high the bar was going in, because, you know, I'd been in so many meetings where, you know, we'd read really good books but not ended up taking them on because, you know, we had something similar coming up, or because it was really great but nobody felt kind of completely passionate about it enough to take it on. And it does, you know, it makes you very aware how much of it is pot luck. But in terms of actually getting published, I don't think it helped at all, mainly because it gave me a huge attack of stage fright. I'd written all my life. I've written right since I was a little girl, all through my teens, all through my 20s. And when I got started in publishing was probably when ordinarily I would have started thinking, you know, maybe I should do something about this, perhaps I should start sending my books out to agents. But instead I was working with all these incredible names, you know, Booker Prize winners and Nobel Prize winners, and it just made it really hard to look at my own sort of slightly rubbish first draft attempts on my computer, because, you know, everybody's first drafts are rubbish, that's how it works, and believe that this could have a future in a bookshop. So for years I just kept writing and kept putting my books under the bed. And it was only when I had kids that I suddenly realized that my writing was basically a hobby, and I didn't have time for hobbies anymore. You know, I barely had time to wash my hair, let alone spend hours kind of, you know, writing about adventures and crimes and murders and stuff. So I realized that unless I found a way to make my writing pay, I wasn't going to be able to keep doing it. And that was what made me start to take it seriously, start to write with a view for publication and send it out to an agent. And when I did, I deliberately picked an agent I hadn't worked with in a sector I didn't know anything about, didn't say what I did, because I wanted, I don't know, I didn't want to. I think I was horrified by the idea of being rejected by someone and then having to go and, you know, meet them in my professional capacity afterwards. So I sort of very deliberately tried to put a distance in between it. But it all worked out. My lovely agent is still my agent today. So,
what did you do when you decided to write for children under another name? Did you do it a different way, or was it did you go through the same system?
well, so I started writing for children, in fact, and actually, I think that was what gave me the courage to submit. Was I had an idea for a YA book for teenagers, and at the time I worked in adult publishing and I didn't know anyone in children's publishing, so I think I sort of thought, this is fine, this is safe, because I can send it out. You know, the world of children's agents is completely different, the world of children's publishing is completely different, there's no overlap in terms of editors, so I can send it to people I've never worked with, people who don't know me. They won't, you know, be laughing behind their hands and saying, oh God, Ruth's book was pretty crap, wasn't it? And it just, it felt like a kind of a safe way to start. So that was the book. It was a YA book that got me my agent, and got me my first publishing deal. And I wrote 5 books for teenagers. And then I just had an idea for a book that was clearly not for teenagers. And I was having coffee with a friend, and she said that she'd never read a thriller set on a hen night. And I was reading a lot of thrillers at the time. I love thrillers, I, you know, always have. And I suddenly thought, gosh, you know, what a brilliant idea. And I had that real kind of, if someone else writes this book, I will be pissed off, which I think as a writer is always a good indication that you're onto a good plot. You know, when you feel cross at the thought of someone else getting there before you, it's a sign that you should probably write that book. And I went to see my agent, who by this time, fortunately, had started taking on a few adult clients. When I started working with her, she was like 99% children's. But by this point, 5 years on, she had started working with a few adult writers. And I said, I think I want to write an adult crime novel. And, you know, she very easily could have said, I think you're mad, you know, you've built up a name, you should stick with what you're doing, all of which would have been true. But, you know, she was great. She said, yeah, you know, if that's what you want to do, you go for it, and we'll figure it out. So I wrote In a Dark, Dark Wood, and when it was eventually sold to a publisher, they didn't want me to use the same name that I'd used for my YA. I think mainly because they didn't want letters from parents of traumatized 10-year-olds who had, you know, picked up what they thought was the next in the series and found it was full of kind of, you know, swearing and drink and drugs and murder. And partly, I think, just to make a clear distinction between the two, to make it clear that these were my adult books and these were my children's books. So I had to choose a different name, and because In a Dark, Dark Wood was a very long title, the design department wanted a short name. So I kept my first name, which is Ruth, and just shortened my surname down.
When you started that, you did an English degree in Old English. My assistant has got a degree himself in history, and we were just interested to know whether you might go and write an historical crime novel based in Old English or anything like that.
Well, so my degree was on English, all of English literature. So we had a big section on Old English and, you know, Beowulf and, you know, The Dream of the Rood and all of that kind of stuff, which for anyone who doesn't know Old English, it's like a completely foreign language. It's closer to German in some ways than, which I don't speak, than it is to modern English. So you need a dictionary to read it. You need an understanding of a completely different grammatical system. And then we did a lot of Middle English, which is like, you know, Chaucer and all the sort of medieval, more Arthur and all those kind of texts. But the majority of my degree was modern English, which starts at Shakespeare. But yeah, I've always loved reading, particularly kind of Old English and Middle English. It fascinates me to see the novel being created. You know, these are texts that come from a time before we had novels. You know, there wasn't such a thing, and you gradually see people sort of figuring out what's possible within the fat of a 90,000 word manuscript. And, you know, we have plays and then poetry, and gradually the novel sort of starts to coalesce, and then, you know, becomes, so I love all of that. And actually one of my YA books was historical, and I love the whole process of research. So far all of my crime novels have been modern day, but I would definitely, I have, every time I've sat down to write a crime, well, not every time, but the last few, I've thought, wonder if this one should be a historical. And I've never quite had the right period or had an idea that would work, so I haven't done it yet, but it's something I would like to do in the future.
When I was looking at what you've done in the past, I was thinking about the protagonists you've chosen, and how they're all from different areas. What made you choose like a history approach when you did the Turn of the Key, because that was a very different angle to what you'd taken before?
Yeah, so my main characters, I suppose, have certain things in common. So far, I've always written women and kind of young women. I've never written anyone older than me. So I think to a certain extent, I've been writing about my own experiences. You know, they've been quite diverse in terms of background and age, right from sort of teenagers upwards. But yeah, I've always felt like I had a kind of a foothold in their experience. I wouldn't say I'd never write a bloke. I think I probably might, but I haven't found the right plot yet that would have a male protagonist. But I've tried to do something a little bit different with every book in terms of you know, just telling it in a slightly different way. Some of them present tense, some of them in past tense, some of them in third person. Turn of the Key, as you mentioned, is epistolary, which so it's written in the form of letters from my main character to her solicitor. And at the beginning, when I started doing that, I wasn't sure if I could pull it off. Epistolary novels aren't very fashionable anymore. They used to be. They had a big vogue, I guess, back in the day when people wrote more letters. And then there was a sort of brief experiment when blogging and emails came around, with sort of 21st century writers sort of trying to figure out if they could write an email epistolary novel, which I think is totally possible. But none of them ever seem to kind of, it doesn't feel like a form that is that much used anymore. And I was a bit worried about giving myself this frame, because I thought I would find it constrictive or difficult to maintain in terms of plausibility. But I read a couple of books which kind of gave me the courage to tackle it. And one was Dolores Claiborne by Stephen King, which is told in the form of a long monologue from a woman, Dolores Claiborne, who walks into a police station to give herself up for a crime. And the whole book is one long monologue from Dolores. You never hear from the police officers, although sometimes you can infer that they've tried to interrupt her or ask her something, because you get her saying, "Hush your mouth, you know, I knew you when you were a little boy and you can't talk to me like that," kind of thing. And the other book, which really inspired me, was Imran Mahmood's You Don't Know Me, which is told from the point of view of a young guy who's been accused of crime, and he's on trial, and halfway through the trial he sacks his barrister because he thinks his barrister thinks he's guilty. And so he gives his own closing speech, like the summing up that the barrister gives at the end of the court case. He gives it himself because he's now representing himself. And and the whole novel is told in the form of this single closing speech, which is of course completely implausible, because as an audiobook it takes about 15 hours to narrate, and there's no way a judge would really let a defendant stand in the dock for 15 hours and just hold forth. But you completely believe it. I don't know what Imran Mahmood is a barrister himself, so the legal details are very convincing, apart from this one big suspension of belief, and you just get so sucked in that you sort of stop caring about the fact that this frame is slightly implausible. So having seen those two examples where the entire narrative is carried in the voice and the perspective and the narrative of one person, I thought, if they can do it, I want to have a crack. And I think people have gone with it. Like I think I get a lot of comments saying I wasn't sure about it at the beginning, and at first I couldn't imagine reading a book entirely told in letters, but after a while I just forgot that was the format, and that's what I wanted, really.
I must admit, I read the book from my mood by audiobook as well. Is that where you started with it, on audiobook? Because you mentioned that in the answer.
No, I read that because I read it in pre-publication. I love audiobooks, but one of the, this is very my diamond shoes are too tight, but one of the lovely things about being an author is that you get sent pre-publication proofs, but one of the sad things is that this is usually before the audiobook is available. So I read it in proof format before the audiobook came out. But where possible, I really like audiobooks, and I think they can bring a very different experience to it. Some books I would always prefer to read rather than listen to, because my concept of the characters and their voices is so strong. I think it would be spoiled by hearing someone else's interpretation. But lots of books. I just finished Lisa Jules' The Invisible Girl, which is brilliantly done on audiobook, and the narrator for Sapphire, one of the characters, is just fantastic. And I think I'm sure I would have loved it no matter how I'd consumed it, but I couldn't imagine anyone doing it better. So
how do you get on with the audio versions of your own book? Because Imogen Church is very well known, isn't she?
She is, yeah. I think quite a lot of people come to my books through loving Imogen as a narrator, and they look up what else she's done, which is fantastic. She's brilliant, but I can't listen to my own audiobooks. I always listen to a snippet just to check that I kind of agree with the voice that she's using and everything. But it's a bit, I don't know, I think it's because it's nothing to do with Imogen. It's the fact that it's my own words, and I hear things that I would change, and obviously I don't read my own books either, apart from obviously I have to do it sometimes at book readings and stuff, but I never sit down and think, I don't know, I'll read one of my own novels tonight, because you see stuff that you don't like, stuff that makes you cringe, stuff that you wish you could change, and hearing it is somehow worse. It's a bit like that moment when you have to phone your own home and you get your own voice on the answer phone, and you just sit there thinking, oh God, I've got such a stupid voice, and why did I say that annoying thing at the end of the message? It's better just to not.
Perfectly understandable. A lot of authors do say that. When you are reading from your own books at book events, how do you decide which part you'll read from? Do you have a technique for that?
Well, usually it comes down to how long they want me to read for, because often the requirements are very specific. So they'll say, we want a 7-minute reading or something. And I always try to give the audience something that is self-contained, something ideally that ends on a cliffhanger, so they'll want to read on, and something that doesn't require too much kind of explaining about prior events in the plot. So you want a kind of a nice incident that's dramatic, reads well, but doesn't require a lot of knowledge about who the other characters are. And very often that's the beginning, because at that point, you haven't introduced dozens of other characters, so there's not people wandering on that you have to say, oh, that's her cousin, kind of thing. But sometimes it's not. So the beginning of One by One has quite a lot of scene setting, quite a lot of characters walking on, which would, I think, be quite confusing if you weren't going to read the rest of the book. So when I read that, I tend to read a section from quite a lot further in where the avalanche is descending on the chalet, because it's a nice extract and it tells you a bit about the characters involved without needing to know anything beforehand. And I do edit, that's the other thing. A lot of authors don't, they just read verbatim what's in the book. But I will quite happily strike out paragraphs if there's like a confusing reference to something that the audience might not know about. And I will sometimes take out swear words as well, because I think most people know, like when they buy my books, if not all of them contain swearing, but the ones that do, it's usually there right from the beginning. But I feel that people who've come to an event, maybe to see other authors and not me, don't necessarily want to hear live swearing.
Right. I can understand why you do that, but I think swearing sometimes you need it for the characters. What's your favourite character that you've written that may want to go back to, or like do a short exhibit on?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm really fond of all of my characters. I'm often asked if I'd write sequels to, so lots of people want a sequel to The Woman in Cabin 10, because that ends on not a cliffhanger, but there's the final scene. It kind of forces you to reappraise what's happened, and I think people would like to hear more about that. And The Turn of the Key also has an ending where there is a very significant unanswered question. That's a sort of homage to The Turn of the Screw, which has a huge question at the end that the reader has to decide for themselves. And I didn't want to use the same question, but I wanted to leave the reader with a question that they had to be the judge of. And a lot of people want an answer to that question. So I do get asked for a sequel to that one quite a lot. But I don't know, in terms of my favourite characters, they're usually actually the minor characters, just because I think I spend less time in their heads. So I feel like I want to get to know them more. So probably the people that I would probably like to have a drink with most are Nina from In a Dark, Dark Wood, and maybe Danny from 1 by 1. He's the chef in 1 by 1, and he is a brilliant character. And yeah, I'd love to have given him whole extra chapters of his own, but unfortunately he wasn't at the centre of the narrative. So
Yeah. Do you think you might use him as a inference for the idea of writing a male character? Because I think that was really good as a foil for the protagonist in 1 by 1.
Yeah, well, he'd be quite a sort of ballsy one to start off with, because he's not just male, he's also black and gay. So that would be 3 experiences that are not my own, and quite a lot of, being careful that I didn't misrepresent anyone else's reality. But I would love to write about Danny, but the problem I've always had is I don't write procedurals. So there's a sort of plausible limit to the number of times that any of my characters can get involved in life-changing homicides. And I feel it's perfectly reasonable to think that, one crime could drop into your existence in the course of your life. It happens all the time to people. Their peaceful lives are shattered by a murder, or, being on the periphery of one, or something like that. So that, I feel, is completely plausible. But what is not plausible is that it would happen again and again over the course of several books. And you don't want that sort of Murder, She Wrote effect where, it works brilliantly for Murder, She Wrote, which I love, but my books are not Murder, She Wrote, and I don't think I could pull that off in a realistic way. So yeah, it would have to be, for me to do a sequel to any of my books or to reuse any of the characters, I would have to find a way to explain why these characters had been caught up in similar events twice running. Yeah.
One of my favourite characters that I've read this week has to be the lisping debt collector. What made you come up with him? Because he's very unique.
Sorry, I didn't hear the
lisping debt collector from The Death of Mrs. Westaway.
Oh, yes. Oh, Honestly, I don't know where he came from, apart from, well, so when I started writing that book, for anyone who hasn't read The Death of Mrs. Westaway, it's about a girl who receives a letter out of the blue saying that she's inherited a substantial bequest from her grandmother, but she knows that the letter has been misaddressed. She's got the same name as the person the letter is addressed to, but the person in it isn't her grandmother, and she knows that it's not meant for her, but she sets out to claim the inheritance anyway. So when I started to write that book, I wanted to write a really amoral main character, someone who was kind of very ethically grey and a bit of an anti-hero, not quite Tom Ripley sort of level, but definitely someone who's a bit morally shady. But the problem was I just fell in love with her, really, and I got more and more sympathetic to her, and I kept trying to find reasons why it was okay for her to do this. And an early part of this was I realized I had to, like, it's a risky thing that she does, you know. She sets out to fool a family of complete strangers that she's like their long lost niece, and it's high stakes and statistically quite unlikely to work. And so I knew I needed to give her a reason why she would go to such lengths and take such risks for what might turn out to be quite a small amount of money. And obviously the obvious reason was to give her a very pressing need for a comparatively small amount of money. So at the beginning of the book, I introduced this very sinister debt collector who comes along to kind of put the frighteners on her. And I don't know where the lisp came from. It just, I think there's something about, maybe because it's sort of quite typically quite a sweet infantile thing, you know, we associate lisp with little kids who've lost their teeth and it's quite adorable. And so to put that on someone kind of deeply sinister and deeply violent and deeply sort of horrible, it somehow makes them more sinister rather than less.
Yeah, Imogen did it really well. It made it come out really good, because it's so unique to hear someone trying to do a lisp when they've not got one. Yeah. I was looking at the website, and it mentioned about a creation of a murder mystery game. Of course, we met doing a murder mystery, so
we did.
Why do you think that appeals to you that so much?
Well, so the one we met at, obviously, I hadn't written. I think, in fact, I think it might have been Ellie Griffiths who wrote that one.
Possibly. It was, yes, Ellie Griffiths.
It was, yeah, I thought so.
Yeah.
I love murder mysteries, and I played them with friends, and we played one at New Year with a bunch of friends. And over lockdown, I found it really hard to write. And for the first time, I've always done a book a year, ever since I started writing. Oh, excuse me. And I've always had an idea waiting when I started when I stopped the previous book. I always had an idea that I was excited to write about. And suddenly I just didn't. And it was partly just the kind of the demands of homeschooling my kids, and, the house was suddenly full of people, and my husband was home and having to produce 3 meals a day for everybody. And it just, there was a lot going on. But it was also, I think I underestimated how much inspiration I get from just, ordinary everyday encounters, and seeing people in the supermarket and overhearing people on the bus, and, encountering people on the school run. And I wasn't getting any of that. And I wasn't getting any of the kind of little human interest newspaper articles. The turn of the key came about from reading a bunch of articles on this new phenomenon of digital abuse, where when a relationship breaks down, one partner has access to the tech equipment. Typically there's one partner who's the more tech savvy one, who installs, cameras or smart hubs or whatever it might be. And when the relationship breaks down, those can be used against the other partner, and you get tracking devices and cameras can be used to spy on people, and they're listening in through the Home Hub and all this kind of stuff. And that all came from just stumbling across a bunch of articles in the press over the course of a year and thinking, wow, there's like a really weird pattern here that I think I could write about. And the press suddenly was, didn't have any of this. All it had was coronavirus with a side order of Brexit, neither of which I have any desire to write a novel about. And I think my imagination just wasn't, it was just kind of deprived of the usual sort of fuel that comes together to create a novel. So for about 6 months, I just had no real desire to write and no time to write and no real ideas that I wanted to tackle. But I'm a bit of a workaholic and I didn't find it that easy to just do nothing. So doing a murder mystery game felt like a fun way to kind of flex my muscles in a sort of less demanding way, because actually, although those games do have plot and stuff, they're very artificial. They're kind of a microcosm. You have to create these characters very quickly for other people to embody. So it was really fun to write. And yeah, it feels like, now we're all in lockdown again. People need stuff that they can do over Zoom and Skype to put them in touch with other human beings. So I hope that it will find an audience out there.
I did send it to Amy, the carer that was with us on the table. I sent it to her so she could do it with her mates on Zoom. So maybe she'll tell me how it goes.
Yeah. Tell her to send me feedback.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be great because I enjoyed it when we did it. Quite coincidentally, we won, didn't we? So that was quite.
It's my finest hour.
I've still got the picture of you like cheering with the rest of the table, so that's great. What
I didn't win the following year and we didn't win, so that was the pinnacle of my achievement, sadly.
What cocktail would you suggest for people to drink while doing the game? Because you recommended cocktails and things on the website when you were doing.
Yeah. So originally I sort of, most of these games are conceived to be done over a dinner party. So I put some recipes in at the end that are kind of themed to the sort of characters and the setting. But of course, the reality is that at the moment, we're not going around each other's houses for dinner. So it seems much more likely that people will be, playing them over Zoom. I think it would depend who your character is. So there's Dolores de l'Amour, who is a sort of aging glamour puss who writes these kind of erotic crime novels about a showgirl, and I think she would have some sort of something in a Manhattan cocktail glass, probably pink, with lots of cherries and cocktail umbrellas sticking out. And then I played Clive Barking, because we did a live action version of it, who's like this sort of very stiff upper lip elderly English gentleman who writes crime novels. And so I think he would probably just have a glass of straight whiskey, maybe with an ice cube, but maybe not even that, probably just a little bit of water. Things like that. I think you'd need to pair it to your character to get it right.
Was that the other day with Steve Kavanagh and Imogen Churchill? Because I saw it afterwards, but I didn't kind of see it at the time. Is there anywhere where people can see that? Is it available on YouTube?
Sadly, no, we couldn't record it because it was an interactive evening. So we got members of the audience up on screen. It was done as like a Zoom webinar. So for the most part, we had the authors on screen reading out the script and playing their parts, and everyone was brilliant. But Liz Nugent played Dolores de l'Amour, and she did it so fantastically. She kind of channeled Barbara Cartland and sort of had this huge hair and loads of makeup and sort of kept swigging out of a cocktail glass. But yeah, everyone was amazing. Lisa Jewell played a former tennis star turned children's crime writer. And Steve Kavanagh played a rough, tough Marine. Dorothy Coomson played Lady Rosamond Hellington. And Abir Mukherjee played Dr. Rowan McTaggart. and Imogen Church played Valerie Chime as the secretary. So yeah, everyone was fantastic. But we brought members of the audience up onto the screen to ask questions and kind of quiz the characters and the authors. And it would have just been too complicated to get a signed release form from everybody involved to then make it. So we couldn't record it, which was a shame. But it'll just live on in everybody's memory.
It just looked really fun, and of course, I can always remember Steve Kavanagh playing his like Trump type character when we did the Theakson's version.
I think he might have reused the same wig. Actually, he started off with one wig and then went away and changed it over and came back with a different one. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I remember that wig, Steve.
Going back to Theakson's, because of course that was a New Blood where I first heard about you and your first book. What was it like doing New Blood, and who would you recommend as a new author for this year?
Well, I actually didn't do New Blood, so I was there for my first novel in a wood, kind of doing stuff on the periphery, and then I went back to the Cabin 10. I did a Christie panel.
That's right.
Abir Mukherjee was on New Blood the first year I was at Harrogate, which was really cool because we're now mates, which was really nice. Oh gosh, I don't know, who have I read this year? I'm reading one at the moment. I haven't finished it yet, so I don't know how the end will go. But it's called Mirrorland, and it's very, very spooky and very twisty. And I think it's a debut. And it's about two twins, and one of them has gone missing, and they have this kind of imaginary land in the house called Mirrorland. So that's all I can say at the moment because I'm only about 10% of the way through, but it's very good so far.
When you get sent proof copies, it must be busy for your schedules. How do you set your time so you can do the proof copies and your writing at the same time?
Well, my writing comes first because that pays bills. So that's it basically. Is I treat the writing like a job. When the kids go off to school, I sit down, I write, I do my taxes, social media, all that kind of stuff. And then the reading happens in the evenings, in my spare time. In a normal year, obviously, I'd be traveling a lot because I, go off to see my foreign publishers and do various kind of, international festivals and stuff. And I'm not the kind of writer who can write on the road. I really admire people who, sit there tapping away in airport cafes, but I can't. So I get a lot of reading done on planes and trains and, hanging around waiting for lifts to turn up. But yeah, it just fits in around everything else. But the main constraint I have is that I find I can't read crime when I'm starting out on a new book. I think because I need to develop the voice of the main character and find out who they are. And if you've got someone else's voice in the back of your head, it's sort of like trying to hum one tune while listening to another. It kind of sends you slightly sort of dizzy. So when I'm starting a new book, I have to stop reading crime. And then I usually go back to reading kind of old favourites and historical novels or anything that's a lot of non-fiction as well, anything that's kind of sufficiently different to not overlap. But once the book is underway and the characters are established and I know who they are, then I can go back to reading the competition. And that does often mean that I don't get to stuff because obviously your quotes aren't as useful after publication, which I feel incredibly guilty about when I've been sent books and you suddenly look at the pub date and you're like, oh, that was 6 months ago. I'm probably a bit late to the party. But yeah, I just read as much as I can and just go by what I think looks good, much in the same way as when you walk around a bookshop, you just think, well, that grabs me or that doesn't. So it's purely subjective.
So when you're looking for somebody to grab you, is it covers that grab you or is it other things?
Well, actually, one of the I guess good things. I don't know really. One of the interesting things about proofs is often they don't have covers, or they don't have a final cover. Or certainly their covers usually aren't as nice as the real book. They're often just kind of photocopy bits of paper. So actually you take them much less on what they look like and much more on what the editor says about them. Because usually they arrive accompanied by some kind of note from either the editor or the author or the publicist saying, you know, this is why I think this book would appeal to you, this is why I think it's special, this is what other people have said about it, if that's applicable. And so, yeah, 99.9% of the time, that is what grabs me, or usually like a recommendation from someone that I trust. If it's an editor whose other books I've really enjoyed, I know that I will probably like their other stuff. So that's what sways me most. I mean, for sure, I guess the cover has some impact just because it can sort of make you think, oh, that looks intriguing, but much, much less than when I'm looking around a bookshop, when, yeah, of course, I look at the covers first.
What's the favourite of your own covers? Because I know that you've got a lot of foreign covers as well now that you've done it in other territories, so they must be all different.
Yeah, you can see I've got all my, I don't know if I can show you, got all my foreign books up here. That's all of these are Ruth Ware's, which makes me feel very egotistical. I don't know what is my favourite. I have a real soft spot for the Ukrainian in the dark wood, which is really unusual. I'm going to see if I can find it. Hang on. Oh no, I can't. I don't seem to be able to find my physical copy, but it's on my. Oh, there you go. It's this one. Look, it's just really different. And they did a similar one for the Woman in Cabin 10 that was like a kind of blood splot that made it look like a boat. Just because it's so unusual and so kind of, yeah, conceptual. But I'd really struggled to pick a favourite cover, to be honest. I think that one just stood out because it was so different to all the others. But I don't honestly know if I could say, yeah, that's my favourite cover.
What would you say has been your most difficult thing about going on foreign tours, and have you ever had any awkward questions?
Gosh, good question. I mean, for the most part, it's a complete joy, and I love getting to travel the world and go to all sorts of places where, you know, I never thought I would be able to go, let alone my books. I've had some funny questions. I wouldn't say they were necessarily awkward. The most memorable one is I did an event in America. I think it might have been St. Louis. And one of the audience members said to me, if you got hit by a bus on the way home, who would you want to finish your novel? I guess ghostwrite it. And I was like, oh my God. I literally couldn't think of a single name, and my mind just went blank because I was just pondering my own demise and sort of thinking, would I want someone to finish my novel? I don't know if I would. So I can't remember who I said. I'm not sure if I even gave a name, but the only thing I could think of to say was, well, there'd have to be someone with a very good imagination because I don't plot. So they wouldn't have any information about how the book was supposed to. They'd literally have my final sentence and that would be it.
I think that's so good. I'm going to have to use that in the next one.
You have my permission to steal it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. One of the questions that the other admins like to ask is, what has been your most memorable moment as an author?
Probably getting on the New York Times bestseller list, just because it was so unexpected. And I think when I thought I was writing in a dark wood, I thought I was writing this weird little British book that, you know, some of my friends would read and you know, maybe my mother-in-law would buy a few copies because she's lovely. And I never expected it to sell in as many territories as it did. And that was a huge surprise. Reese Witherspoon picking it up was incredible. But I just remember so vividly being home alone and curled up on the sofa, and my husband was in bed and the kids were in bed, and my phone ringing and my editor being like, "You're on the New York Times bestseller list," and just doing this kind of little completely incredulous jig. Yeah, I don't think I will ever get over that moment.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm looking forward to the possibilities of that in the future. Yeah. We've got time for a few audience questions. If you can you see them at the side, or do you want me to?
I might be able to. Oh yeah, okay. So someone says, have you been banned from Brighton for rubbishing tarot and fortune-telling charlatans through Hal? I was a bit worried when I started writing that book. So my portrayal of tarot readers in The Death of Mrs. Westaway is not that, well, it's not positive. I have a lot of respect for tarot as a practice, but Hal thinks it's all complete rubbish, which is basically my, like, I don't think there's anything spiritual going on. I don't believe in that kind of stuff. Yeah, I was a bit worried that when the book came out, I might get angry letters from tarot readers. But actually, I think I ended up with a huge amount of respect for tarot readers as an art, because I think it is genuinely psychologically really interesting what comes out of a reading. And I think that came through in the book, because for the most part, people have been pretty positive about it. But I did go to a tarot reader in Brighton, on Brighton Pier, as part of the research for the book, and I deliberately did not tell him my name. Someone says, I'm halfway through the audio version of One by One and I can't stop. How many book ideas do you have in your head at one time? I'm quite monogamous, usually only one or two. Yeah, so normally I stick to an idea pretty rigidly, because I'm worried that if I start thinking about something else, I just wouldn't finish the book I'm on. But I do start to think about the next book I might write towards the end of the one that I'm on. Someone says, I've never read any of your books. Which is the best one to start with? Well, they're all standalones, so they can be read in absolutely any order. So I would just go with whatever subject matter appeals to you. My first book, In a Dark, Dark Wood, is about a murder on a hen night. My second one, The Woman in Cabin 10, is about a murder on a cruise. Third one, The Lying Game, is about girls behaving badly at boarding school, and it ends in murder. The Death of Mrs. Westaway is about tarot and murder. The Turn of the Key is a sort of rewrite of The Turn of the Screw, and One by One is about murder at a ski resort. So whichever one of those grabs you more. The Death of Mrs. Westaway was a little supernatural. Would you go down that road again? Well, I guess I sort of flirted with the same idea in The Turn of the Key, in that it is sort of a kind of gothic. Isn't it? What's going on here? But none of my books are really, like, the resolution is never it was a ghost or anything like that. So I don't think I would ever go full kind of, supernatural. And someone says, when you had your cards read, did any of it come true? Well, so none of the tarot readers that I've ever been to really do future predictions. They're more about sort of asking you questions and stuff that you're worrying about. And the stuff that they do say is so general that it kind of has to come true. It's all stuff about, I see a challenge in the future that you will overcome. And like, of course, there's definitely going to be a challenge. Everybody experiences challenges. So yeah, I would say quite a lot of it did come true, but only in the sense that I was clearly a woman of a certain age in a certain bracket, and he could see that. So there was quite a lot about, parents and kids' responsibilities.
Yeah.
But anyway, I hope this has been a fun evening, and yeah, thank you for having me, Alex. It's been
no problem at all. I've loved reading the books this week, and it's been great hearing about your work in more depth, and I'll definitely make sure I can get around to reading the others that I've not read yet.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone else for watching and asking questions and making comments. And you can find me on Twitter or Facebook as Ruth Ware Writer if you have any other questions. So do get in touch.
Thank you so much, Ruth.